Without further ado, handing over to Shobi Khan, Chief Executive Officer of the Canary Wharf Group, to start this amazing session. Over to you, Shobi.
Thank you, Olga. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the session, The Role of Finance and Cities in Developing a Sustainable Future. It's great to be here at CogX to host a chat with Mark Carney. CogX brings together the best entrepreneurs, academics, big thinkers, policymakers, politicians, CEOs, and world leaders. Mark certainly fits many of those categories. He almost needs no introduction, but just to quickly sketch his career so far. He was previously governor of the Bank of England and also the governor of the Bank of Canada. During the financial crisis, he played a key role as chair of the Financial Stability Board. Since then, Mark has focused his time on climate change, an issue he firmly put on the map with central banks and the financial services sector. He is now the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Change, for Climate Action and Finance, as Boris Johnson's finance advisor for the COP26 climate conference. In March, he published his book, Values. It explores how economic value and social values have become blurred, and they have moved from a market economy to a market society. Hopefully we'll dig into that a little bit in today's session. And finally, when he's not busy focusing his energies on saving the planet, he is also the vice chairman and head of impact investing at Brookfield Asset Management, who is an investor in Canary Wharf Group. So it's a privilege for me as CEO of Canary Wharf Group to be able to work with him. There's no better placed person to discuss the role of finance and cities in delivering a sustainable future. I've prepared a few questions for Mark, but we'll leave a few minutes at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat room and we'll get to them. Mark, first, congrats. Appreciate you hanging in there while we had technical difficulties. I know it's early in the morning for you, so greatly appreciate you taking the time. So let me start on your recently published first book. It's your first book, correct?
I think, yeah, first book and last book, Shobi. I won't inflict another one.
600 pages of a masterpiece there. So you can say one thing that, you've got tangible evidence of what you did during the pandemic. So let me start. One of the themes is to build a fair and sustainable world. So, first, why does this agenda matter to you? And when did you first start thinking about this?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me, and it's a great pleasure. There's I think no better group actually to discuss sustainability, sustainable cities than you and Canary Wharf. So I'm looking forward to engaging. Look, from sustainability, let's just take a step back. Sustainability means satisfying the needs of the present without compromising those of the future. And actually, of course, what we're all trying to do is leave a better world for those who come after us. And there's really three pillars of that. There's the environment, obviously, and I've focused on that, but that's absolutely interconnected with the economic and the social. I mean, we won't achieve our climate goals unless we grow our economy, and we have to grow that economy fairly in order to have the social coalition there. So that's the backdrop, and of course this all comes together from a city's agenda. 70%, 80% of us plus in the UK, of course, live in cities, and it's important that those cities are sustainable and they have each of those pillars: economic, environmental, and social. Now, in terms of my greater focus on this agenda, it really began or intensified when I became governor of the Bank of England. And the shorthand reason for that was we oversee the insurance industry in the UK, the fourth largest in the world, including Lloyd's of London, the most sophisticated risk managers for many things, including extreme weather events. And if you oversee that sector, you realize pretty quickly the extent to which these are intensifying and that we need to do something about it. Finance will play an absolutely central role. It's integral to any solution that we're going to have. And I'm very pleased to see how well the city has responded to that agenda. In fact, I would argue that the UK is leading the way in terms of mainstreaming sustainable finance.
And so you mentioned the insurance industry and Lloyd's and so forth. So when you were the governor of the Bank of England, is that when not only the financial services sector, but then also investors as you look at all the different products that are available in terms of, sustainability? When did the investors try to catch on of what was happening?
Yeah, it's interesting. It goes farther back. If you think back in early, late 60s, early 70s, there was sustainable or socially responsible investing, which was really about screening out negative things, areas investors didn't want to be involved in. Think of apartheid, tobacco, areas like that. But it gathers pace in the early 2000s when we start to get information. That's the foundation. So the Carbon Disclosure Project, the most important bits coming out of London, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, 2006, SASB, which is a sustainable accounting framework, and then very importantly, the TCFD in 2015, which was launched at the Paris climate meeting and delivered actually really Shobi 3 years ago to this date. And what's happened, so you have the basis of information that develops, and up until a few years ago, very active development of sustainable investing, particularly focused around climate, but more in to be candid, more in niche areas, so specific products that are developed. And what has changed is that in the last couple of years, on the basis of much better information, spurred on by the imperative of addressing the issue, and also encouraged by what countries are doing. We now have 130 countries, for example, who've committed to net zero, covering 70% of global emissions. This has moved from the periphery, if you will, of finance absolutely to the mainstream. And the good news is that finance increasingly has the information it needs to take the decisions it can, in other words, to allocate capital to those who are part of the solution and withhold it from those who remain part of the problem.
Obviously, we've all been affected by the pandemic in the last 18 months or so. So how do you think COVID, what's your view of how COVID has impacted not only the world, but then the financial sector and climate change in terms of that? And has anything in your mind changed because of this?
Yeah, I think it has changed in a couple, and to be candid, Shobi, when COVID started 15, 16 months ago, I was just finishing at the Bank of England, and if you'd asked me then, I could have made the argument that it could have gone either way. What we did see in 2008 with the global financial crisis was it stalled the progress that was being made on that mainstreaming of sustainable investment. As I said a moment ago, there was a start of a groundswell of climate information that began prior to the financial crisis, and the focus on these issues was picking up. But it was absolutely, I'm overstating a bit, but more or less set aside for a few years while the economic crisis was addressed. And there was a part of me that thought, well, we could see this again. That hasn't happened. It's very clear that has not happened. COVID has accelerated the focus on sustainability. And the question is why? Well, I think some of the aspects of COVID have resonated with the issues around climate. So, it's clear that resilience is important. It's also clear that it's important to listen to scientists if they're warning you about predictable disasters, not uncertainties, not of risks, but of things that will happen, and that advanced preparation is the best way to address them. And we didn't do all the advanced preparations for COVID. That's clear. That's true of virtually every country around the world. And, that's part of the reason why we had to take the extreme measures we did. Climate, we won't get a second chance. And what also has been underscored from COVID is that there is the option. It's difficult, it's painful, but there is the option to self-isolate from COVID, including for countries that are out in front. And of course, we see the various restrictions that are in place in the debates around loosening travel restrictions and others, taken from a science-based perspective. we can't, that's irrelevant. It's an irrelevant debate from a climate perspective. One planet, one climate. We all need to work on this together. The consequence of all of that has been to reinforce the focus. I make two other points, actually, which are important here. One is that the track record of sustainable investing has been very strong. So that has reinforced the approach, and the performance in the initial difficult period of the crisis was also strong. And then on top of it, the economics have shifted quite substantially. And in 2008, renewables was depended on the jurisdiction, depended on the type of renewables, but it required government support on wind, solar. Now it's very economic, and of course, we, as you know, Shobi, in terms of Canary Wharf's activities, I think you've been, sourced. You correct me, but you've been sourcing renewable powers for years, since 2012, right? And on track. And actually, maybe I'd ask you to draw this out a bit. On track for net zero for by the end of this decade. At Brookfield, more broadly, we've got 20 gigawatts of renewables, more than enough to power London almost 2 times over. So we know those aspects, and that's all of those combinations, both the science, the focus on resilience, the recognition, you get one shot at this, plus the economics has shifted and accelerated both investing in sustainable solutions, and I would hope, and hope, and a little more than hope, I expect, accelerate the solutions to this enormous problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, to your point about, the past history, I think it's been sustainability is part of Canary Wharf's DNA, and we've been working on, no waste to landfills for the last 10 years, using renewable energy since 2009. So I think that what I've gotten out of COVID is, the will of the entire world to gather around an issue and to be able to use science and to be able to effectively propose a solution such that you can, take advantage of the science to have a solution. And I think now, as hopefully we were able to, get this under control, the world's attention, i.e. with COP26, is to focus that on the climate and say, okay, how can we use all the science and the will of all these governments to start implementing some policy such that not only companies but governments can start taking the initiative of using renewable energy, of recycling, et cetera, and using green energy to make a difference, because it is a journey, and unfortunately time is not on our side. Yeah. So let's switch to cities, as that's one of the topics of our chat today. Over half the world's population lives in cities, and the UN is targeting that by 2050, almost 70% will be living in cities. In the UK itself, it's over 80%. So what role can cities and developers like Canary Wharf Group, in your mind, play in delivering sustainability?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. And I would say for the first time, this was really recognized in Paris. And one of the, when I say Paris, I mean the Paris COP21, which was about 5.5 years ago. And it was the last big, with all due respect to the ones in, COPs 22 through 25, it was the last big one of these climate meetings. And obviously the next one is in Glasgow this November. And one of the things that happened at that meeting in Paris was the bringing together of large city mayors and a much bigger coalition and sharing of expertise and knowledge across cities, because recognizing that not only, as you just said, Shobi, does half of the world's population in cities en route to 70% in industrialized countries, advanced economies like the UK, well north of 80%, but 70% of emissions globally come from cities. It's not entirely surprising, but it means that an integrated strategy for a city is essential to addressing climate change. And that's what it needs to be. It needs to be an integrated strategy. There needs to be a plan for net zero. It goes to everything from transportation, obviously, to building codes, to mixed use neighborhoods, again, and a sense of livability and sustainability that's established. And maybe actually I'll invite you to comment on this because you're better placed. But if you think about where Canary Wharf is going, at least what I've seen over my lifetime, both in the construction and the early development, it is a absolutely transformed place that has a much greater aspect of all aspects of sustainability, including livability, live, work, play type aspects. But again, I'll defer to you. The basic point, though, whether you're Brookfield, Canary Wharf Group, the City of London, a company watching this, is that we have now an organizing principle for climate, which is we all need to get to net zero. The UK has set out very ambitious targets, appropriately ambitious targets, down 68% by 2030. What that cascades down to the city level is, well, what's the plan in London to contribute to that? What's the plan for individual developers as part of that, or regions of a city? And then for those watching on the on the investing side, on the technology side, I think one of the great things that's coming out of this process is it's clearer where the choke points are. And if you're an entrepreneur, you're an innovator, a choke point is a massive opportunity. And so whether it's HVAC optimization, as an example, or if you're on the power side, it's green hydrogen, and how do you bring green hydrogen in? More and more is that of that is apparent. But just to loop back to where I started and where your expertise is, Shobi, is that a big element of sustainability in all its senses, but including for climate, is creating these ecosystems and these social systems in one location where people want to live, they can work, and that are sustainable.
Absolutely, Mark. I think to your follow-up, I think I'd make 3 points on this. One is from the real estate community, how we build, right? So we're going to constantly be, building in the future of new projects. Is can you build to in the UK it's BREEAM Outstanding, in the US it's LEED, but we are the largest sustainable developer in the entire country, over 11 million square feet. And so as you deliver a new product, not only where the products materials are sourced, but how you build it and what kind of energy usage of those new buildings that can take, because as both for employers who are looking for their well-being of their employees, being in buildings that have great light, great air, that have the amenities that they want, and so forth like that. That's a key component, as well as where you live. So as how you build it, I think, is key. Second is how you operate it. I mentioned earlier in terms of how we recycle nothing to landfills, and we use renewable energy in our power stream. So how you operate these buildings is key, and I think that's what various companies with new startups with technology can look into, and how companies can take advantage of technology to do that. And then finally, you're spot on with your placemaking, right? Being able to live, work, and play, being able to walk to work, being able to have a community where you can walk to work, where you can then go to the grocery store, have restaurants, have parks around you, have light. So that whole mixed use community you mentioned earlier, live, work, play. I think, historically, as an outsider coming into London, the average commute in my unscientific sample is about an hour each way. So as you think about how people now in a post-pandemic world are looking at their quality of life and how they want to do it, being able to offer those options where you can be able to do that and take advantage of public transportation. I think a lot of people now are, reevaluating their quality of life and how they want to work in the future. So I think that is something that hopefully entrepreneurs can take advantage of in terms of where that technology and sustainability is going in that nexus. So let me follow up with kind of more of a half glass, half full kind of question for you in terms of that, how humans can be really impatient when they value much more something today than something in the future. So as we talked about, you mentioned Lloyd's about catastrophic change that happens in climate that will fall largely, in future generations. The current generation has few incentives right now to solve something. So even if we were to act sooner, I think it would be less costly. So how do policymakers and governments decide between growth today and a crisis tomorrow, between health and economics, and between the planet and the profit?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the fundamental question because we've been putting this off for a long time, and now we really do need to act. And I think what policymakers can do is a couple things, and the encouraging thing is we are increasingly seeing that. The first is have a very clear objective, and that's what net zero gives us. But don't just have it far off in 2050. I mean, that's asking a lot of all of us to have that sort of perspective, but a 2030, a 2025 objective, and then that cascading down to the level of the city, to the level of the company, that helps focus the mind. Okay. The second, from a policy perspective, is be predictable and credible. So it matters that, for example, in the UK, that there is now a moratorium on new internal combustion engine vehicles from 2030. If I'm in the auto sector, if I'm a parts supplier, if I'm a steel supplier, whatever, if I'm thinking of building out a charging network, I know that by that point, there is a commercial case for electric vehicles. I mean, there is today, but there is a fundamental commercial case. And actually, I see on the continent a number of those moratoria there as well. So that credibility of the future policy in the future pulls forward and drives investment today. And that gets to my third point, which is what policymakers need to do to address sustainability is to do it in a way that is delivering jobs today, jobs and growth today. And what we find is that there are certain areas that are very job intensive, big job multipliers, big growth multipliers. Green development is one of them. Green energy is another. What I mentioned on the auto side is a third. So these types of policies are the types we need as we come back out of the pandemic period. And if I can just make a short-term point, which is what we have today, is of course we have in all economies that are opening up, very welcome boost to growth that's coming from people's pent-up demand, and that's fantastic as the economy restarts. We want to make sure that that growth is sustained, and it's this type of investment that will sustain it. And I will say, in the case of the UK, the government has a 10-point plan around the environment, and then more detail that follows underneath that. That's the kind of clarity that's necessary to drive these types of investments. And of course, what we also have is two things that you have resident very much in Canary Wharf. One, we have finance, and I would argue the leading financial sector that understands mainstreaming sustainable investing. How do you invest and make money from the transition? And then secondly, world-leading tech sector, which is essential to this. Not just financial technology, but obviously green tech and other aspects of tech that's going to drive it.
Yeah, actually, that was going to be one of my follow-ups. I think you talked about, London has one of the strongest technology innovative startups, and Canary Wharf Group's been very fortunate to start up helping out fintechs with our Level 39 startup, where we've had great companies like Revolut come out of there. So what more, I think, could governments do to encourage startups, especially at the nexus when we talk about climate change and technology?
Well, I think one of the things we all need is to understand where the opportunity set is. So and governments can play a role in providing, supporting. Sometimes it's pulling demand forward for the more growth equity venture type opportunities. Tax policy is very important here as well. In some cases, when I say pulling demand forward, using structures such as contracts for differences, which was really instrumental in developing, for example, the UK offshore wind industry. There are those analogies, plus those type of very clear regulatory measures that I put in place. And one of the things we see is that 60% of emissions reductions can be done economically. It's a question of scale. Now, it's massive scale. It's measured in trillions of dollars per annum additional investment, but it can be done at scale. But the interesting bit, and I think the most interesting bit, is the balance, the 40%, where you get into those emerging technologies. And that's where government needs to concentrate efforts. For example, in the UK, efforts around a hydrogen strategy, direct air capture strategy, those are all very relevant to this. And I know we're running short on time, but I just want to flag one of the audience questions was about green spaces, if I may, and you know this well. Yes, absolutely plays an important role. Green roofs play an important role. Again, something I'll defer to you in terms of expertise there. But one of the emerging issues that the UK is championing and is important in green spaces is the nature of those green spaces and enhancing biodiversity wherever we can, and a recognition that solving climate is a necessary condition for biodiversity, but you also have to actively develop that, and smart cities pay attention to that.
Absolutely. So I think we're running out of time, so we've got time for a couple more questions, but completely agree with you on the question. I think, Jack, you asked about green roofs, green spaces. It's critical, I think, for people's headspace, and then the quality of life, not only on the office side, but on the residential side. We're proud to have over 20 acres of green space. And I think we did research, we're trying to verify, but I think we are the largest owner of green roofs in the entire country. And again,
Wow.
trying to create a sustainable environment for our community there. So another question from the audience: would Canary Wharf and the UK welcome the formation of a new World Bank to the UK to help fill the most important funding gaps to drive how we fund the global crisis globally? So on a financial side, Mark, what has been kind of the point in terms of what financial incentives or government entities could help in terms of?
It's a fascinating question, and it's a timely question coming out of the G7 in Cornwall, because one of the points that the G7 leaders made is that basically, and I'm translating from communique speak into what I would interpret as what they said, is that we, the world, needs to use our what are called multilateral development banks, things like the World Bank, like the EBRD. We need to use them more effectively. And by the way, I should compliment the EBRD. I think they've actually done a very good job in this respect, because they can take risk, but there's different ways to take risk. There's taking risk in ways that kind of, I don't want to say crowd out, but is similar to what the private sector would do. And there's ways to take risk that can absolutely amplify private sector investment to the achievement of what the question says, to achieve the global goals. And I think there is a challenge from the G7 that's come out of Cornwall to the MDBs, and indeed to all of us, is can we make the existing institutions more effective in doing exactly that? And let me make just to put it in context, I think the units of account on climate change are 100 billion a year on an annual basis. So, by which I mean, if you're doing something, if it doesn't increase the flow of investment by at least that amount, it's only of interest as a pilot. And that's the way we need to start counting, because as I said earlier, the incremental investment that's required is on the order of 2 trillion globally, and that is very much globally. And so, you need institutions that are going to have that impact and can work effectively with the private sector in order to deliver it.
Mark, appreciate it. Thanks for your words of wisdom. Appreciate you getting up early for the CogX session. Look forward to what happens as the year progresses, especially with COP26 later this year. And then I think for everyone, a call to action. I think climate change is on all of us. So whether we're individuals or working at companies, it's on all of us to try to make a difference, because we all live on one planet. Okay, so Olga, we'll throw it back to you to continue the sessions.
All right, great. Thank you.